The jungle was still. The gunfire had stopped hours ago, but war has a way of echoing, not in sound but in silence. Smoke curled through the palm trees. 2 American Marines, their uniforms torn and faces streaked with mud, moved cautiously through the ravaged valley. They were searching for survivors, or maybe ghosts. At this stage of the war, it was hard to tell the difference. One of them, Sergeant Miller, paused. He thought he heard something, faint breathing, almost like the sigh of wind over coral stone. He raised a hand. "Hold up," he whispered. They followed the sound toward a cluster of rocks, the entrance to a cave half hidden by vines. A trail of blood led inside. They had seen this before. In Okinawa, in Iwo Jima, caves where soldiers chose death over capture. Inside you never knew what waited. A grenade, a frightened boy, or nothing but bones. Miller lifted his rifle. Private Hayes took a deep breath. They stepped into the darkness. The smell hit first, damp earth and blood. Then a whisper. A figure crouched behind a rock, trembling. A young Japanese woman, her kimono torn, her arm bleeding badly. Her eyes widened in terror. She screamed something, "Yamaro? Don't come closer." Her voice cracked like glass. She raised a small dagger, shaking. And then, she froze. Because the 2 Marines didn't fire. They didn't even move. Miller slowly lowered his weapon. From his pocket he pulled a canteen of water. He placed it gently on the ground between them. No words. Just a gesture, quiet, simple, human. The woman stared, her mind refusing to believe what she saw. For years she had been told Americans were beasts, murderers who burned villages, who would rather kill than show mercy. Now one of them was offering her water. Hayes knelt down, hands open. "It's okay," he said softly, though she didn't understand. The tone was enough. Kindness has a language all its own. She reached for the canteen, her hand trembling. The water touched her lips and she began to sob. Not from pain, but from confusion. This was not the enemy she had been told about. And for the first time since the war began, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Oh. Somewhere far away, the jungle crackled with distant artillery. But here, in this small corner of hell, 3 people shared a moment of peace. And maybe that's how every great story begins, not with victory but with mercy. Before we go deeper into this forgotten moment of the Pacific War, take a second to join us on this journey. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment about what humanity in war means to you, and share this story if you believe compassion can survive even in the darkest times. Now, let's return to that cave where an act of mercy would change 2 lives, and perhaps the way we remember war itself. War at its heart is built on stories. And in the Pacific, those stories were twisted into weapons long before the first bullet flew. To the Japanese people, the Americans were not men, they were monsters. In schools, children were shown posters of soldiers with fangs and claws, devouring women and babies. Newspapers screamed warnings, better to die than to fall into enemy hands. Mothers whispered to their daughters, "If the Americans come, take your own life first." It was a campaign of fear so powerful that even the innocent began to believe it. In 1944, Tokyo's military radio filled the air with voices preaching hate, a steady drumbeat that told every soldier, every civilian, that surrender was worse than death. And when you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes truth in the mind. To the west, across the ocean, another story was being told. In America, men read headlines about Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, and kamikaze attacks. The word Japan became a synonym for cruelty. Posters showed sneering samurai, painted in blood-red ink, mocking democracy itself. Every image said the same thing: this is evil. This must be stopped. 2 nations, both certain of their righteousness, both terrified of the other. That's how wars like this one feed themselves, on fear and the stories that make fear seem noble. By 1943, the U.S. Marines were fighting island by island across the Pacific. Places so small most Americans had never heard their names. Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan. Each a speck of land that turned into hell. When the Marines landed, the air itself seemed to burn. Machine guns stitched through palm leaves. The ocean turned red within minutes. Every step forward cost lives. In Tarawa, 3,000 Marines fell in just 3 days. At Iwo Jima, the sand hid tunnels filled with Japanese defenders who refused to die quietly. They fought from the shadows, from beneath the earth, from inside caves that smelled of sulfur and fear. But even amid this horror, American soldiers carried something else: a code. Orders from the top reminded them that prisoners must be treated with dignity, that even the enemy deserved water, food, and medical care. It wasn't always followed. War makes men savage. But the principle was there, written in the Geneva Convention, signed years before anyone knew the name Iwo Jima. Still, on both sides, compassion was a rumor, rare, fleeting, almost unbelievable. When the Marines reached Saipan, they found cliffs littered with civilians. Whole families had jumped rather than surrender. Mothers clutching babies, fathers wrapping themselves in flags before leaping into the sea. They weren't cowards, they were believers. They believed the stories told to them since birth, that Americans would torture, humiliate, and destroy them. And yet, after the smoke cleared, American medics were the ones climbing those cliffs, bandaging the wounded, giving water to the living. Some Marines wept openly when they saw the bodies below. Private diaries from Saipan tell of soldiers whispering, "If only they knew we weren't here to kill them." Fear had built a wall higher than any mountain, and it was made of lies. The truth was, both nations fought by codes that could never understand each other. Japan had Bushido, the way of the warrior, a creed of honor and sacrifice. Death before surrender. Glory in obedience. To yield was shameful. America had something else, a belief in the value of life even in war. A sense that mercy didn't make you weak. That strength meant knowing when to stop fighting. These ideas clashed in every battle, every encounter, every moment when a Marine held his fire or a Japanese soldier chose suicide. It was not just a war of bullets. It was a war of souls. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard of ideals. Thousands of young men on both sides were gone, and millions of civilians were trapped between governments that promised glory and delivered only ashes. The woman in the cave, the one the Marines would later find, was one of those lost souls. She had grown up believing the lie. She had seen friends die for it. And now, she would discover something her empire had never taught her: that mercy could come wearing an American uniform. Because as one Marine wrote in his journal that summer, the Americans fought to win, but they also fought to save what was left of humanity. And that's where her story begins. Not in hatred. Not in propaganda. But in the quiet collapse of everything she thought she knew. Before the jungle, before the blood, she had been a teacher. Her name was Hana. She was 24, with a voice as soft as morning rain and eyes that carried both kindness and fear. In Nagasaki, before the war swallowed everything, she taught children how to write poems about the moon. Her classroom smelled of chalk and ink. The windows looked out over a narrow street filled with bicycle bells and the laughter of market women. In those days she believed in small things: the sound of paper sliding under a brush, the joy of a child learning his first character, the rhythm of ordinary life. But ordinary life was a luxury Japan could no longer afford. By 1944, the war had reached every doorstep. Hana's students stopped coming to class. One by one the boys were drafted, some barely 16. The girls learned to sew bandages and make rice balls for soldiers they'd never meet. At night, Hana stood by her window, listening to the sirens wail across Nagasaki Bay. She whispered their names like prayers. Rations were thin. Tea was replaced by roasted barley. Fabric was cut into smaller kimonos. But what hurt more than hunger was hope, the quiet kind that still dared to imagine peace. She never spoke of it aloud. Such thoughts were dangerous. She had a fiancé, Kenji, a medic in the Imperial Army. They met in a hospital corridor 2 years earlier when she brought books for wounded soldiers. He had gentle hands, a shy smile, and a promise that sounded like forever. He told her, "When the war ends, we'll open a small clinic together. Somewhere with flowers." But forever is a word that doesn't survive war. In early 1945, Kenji was sent to a remote island, a name she couldn't even pronounce properly, somewhere far in the Southern Sea. Weeks later his letters stopped coming. Then one morning a notice arrived, stamped and formal: transferred to active combat zone. Communication suspended. No explanation. No goodbye. Hana refused to wait in silence. Through favors and family connections she volunteered to join the medical corps. Her reasoning was simple: if she couldn't save him, she would at least serve beside him. The army didn't encourage it, but desperation finds a way. By the spring of 1945 she was on a transport ship headed south, the same islands the Americans were closing in on. The air smelled of salt and rust. Soldiers stood on deck, silent, faces hard. No songs, no laughter. They all knew what awaited them, a fight to the death. When Hana arrived, the island was already half destroyed. The sky thundered with American bombers. Hospitals were tense. Medicines ran out within days. She tied rags around wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. She whispered comfort to boys too young to shave, boys who called for their mothers as they died. And then one afternoon the shelling began. It didn't stop for 2 days. By the time the noise faded, the camp was gone. Bodies everywhere, Japanese, American, unrecognizable. The smell of iron and fire. Hana stumbled through the ruins calling for Kenji. She found him half buried under debris, his uniform burned, his pulse gone. She buried him with her bare hands, then buried her fear in silence. For 3 days she wandered the jungle half-starved, her arm wounded by shrapnel. She ate leaves, drank from muddy streams and slept beneath broken palms. Sometimes she thought she heard his voice, soft, distant, telling her to live. Other times she wished she hadn't heard anything at all. She found a cave on the 4th day. Dark, cool, hidden. Inside, she lit a small fire with damp twigs and prayed to whatever god still listened. The pain in her arm worsened, fever blurred her vision. When she closed her eyes, she saw her classroom, her students bowing, laughing, waving goodbye. She remembered Kenji's promise of flowers. And then she remembered the propaganda, the leaflets, the warnings, the speeches. They will torture you, they said. They will shame you. Better to die pure than to live defiled. So she waited for death. But death, it seemed, was busy elsewhere. Days passed. The rain came. The jungle grew quiet. And then footsteps. She pressed herself against the cave wall, clutching the broken dagger she had carried since Kenji's death. 2 shadows appeared at the entrance. Voices, foreign, deep, careful. American voices. Her breath caught. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they could hear it. Every story she'd been told screamed in her mind, "They'll kill you. They'll laugh while they do it." Her body trembled, torn between fight and surrender. The footsteps drew closer. Light flickered on the cave wall. And then, the moment that would change everything. The water, the gesture, the silence. Hana didn't know it then, but the men who found her weren't demons. They were 2 tired boys from Iowa and Pennsylvania, lost in a war neither of them fully understood. And through their small act of mercy, they would shatter years of hatred, not with words but with decency. War had taken her home, her students, her love. Now, against all odds, it was about to give her something back. Something fragile. Something almost forgotten. A chance to believe again. The night they found her, the rain hadn't stopped. It drummed on helmets, rifles, and tin cups, a steady percussion of exhaustion. The 2 Marines who discovered the woman carried her out of the cave like she was made of glass. She didn't fight. She didn't speak. She just stared at the ground, lips cracked, hands trembling around an invisible memory. Her name, they didn't know it yet. Her fear, they could feel it from a mile away. Back at the temporary camp, under a sagging canvas roof, she sat alone. A single lantern flickered beside her, throwing long shadows on the dirt. A medic tried to offer her water. She turned her head away. He tried again, this time holding the cup closer. Her eyes hardened. "She thinks it's poison," said Sergeant Miller, the older of the 2 Marines who'd found her. He had a square jaw, tobacco-stained fingers, and the calm of a man who'd seen too much. Private Hayes, younger, nervous, still soft around the edges, just nodded, not sure what to do with his hands. "Let her be," Miller muttered. "War'll do that to people." The U.S. Marines, by the book, treated prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention, 1929 edition. Even if the Japanese government hadn't signed it, the Americans still followed it. That meant food, shelter, no torture. It didn't mean trust. The woman, still silent, was given a blanket, a tin of rations, and a corner of the medical tent. A guard was posted outside. She refused the food. She refused sleep. All night, she watched the shadows move like predators across the canvas. Every time someone passed, she flinched. Every creak of boots on mud sounded like a sentence being read. At dawn, Hayes noticed the unopened tin beside her. He crouched down, careful not to get too close. "Food," he said, pointing. "Eat." She stared at him, eyes cold, jaw set. He tapped his stomach. "Hungry." Then pointed at her. "You. Eat." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the rhythm, the awkward kindness in his tone. Still she didn't move. Hayes sighed, opened the tin himself and took a bite. He chewed, swallowed and smiled, clumsy, disarming. Then he pushed the can toward her again. For a long time she didn't react. Then, slowly, her fingers moved. Just a touch, testing the edge of the tin, the warmth of its contents. Her eyes softened only slightly. But in war, slightly was enough. Miller had been fighting since Guadalcanal. He'd lost more friends than he could count. To him, compassion was a dangerous luxury. But he also believed in something he couldn't quite name, maybe decency, maybe just habit. He wasn't the kind to shoot a starving woman, no matter what she'd been told about him. Hayes, on the other hand, was 21. He joined the Marines because his father had fought in France. He still carried a photograph of his little sister in his breast pocket, the corner worn thin from thumbprints. He looked at the Japanese woman not as an enemy, but as someone lost, someone's sister, someone's teacher maybe. Someone who didn't belong in this hellhole either. "Sir," Hayes said one evening, "she's still not talking. Maybe she doesn't want to," Miller replied. "Or maybe she can't." Miller shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Just make sure she doesn't die on us." That was the extent of the order. But to Hayes it felt like a mission. For days they tried to talk. Words failed. Gestures filled the gaps. Hayes pointed at himself, Hayes. Then pointed at her. She stared back, unsure if it was a question or a threat. "Hayes," he repeated, slower, tapping his chest. Finally she spoke, a whisper, trembling, hesitant. "Hana." It was the first sound she'd made since her capture. Hayes smiled. He pointed again. "Hana." She nodded. No translator, no dictionary, just two people armed with patience and curiosity. When she winced from pain, he gestured to her arm. She shook her head, clutching it closer. He didn't insist. Instead he pointed to the medical kit, then to himself, then mimed cleaning a wound. It was almost comical, a clumsy pantomime of compassion. Finally she relented. The wound was worse than it looked. Deep, swollen, reeking faintly of infection. Hayes unrolled a bandage, dipped a cloth in antiseptic and began cleaning it. She didn't flinch at the sting. She'd learned to live with pain. But what startled her wasn't the burn, it was his gentleness. He moved slowly, murmuring nonsense under his breath, as if talking to a frightened child or a wounded bird. Every touch contradicted everything she had been told. For years, propaganda had painted Americans as beasts, men who desecrate, torture, destroy. But here was one, kneeling in the mud, wrapping her arm with hands that trembled from care, not cruelty. "You don't need words to show kindness," Miller said quietly from behind, watching the scene. He didn't say it for her to understand. He said it for himself, as if reminding his own heart what decency looked like. When Hayes finished, he tied the bandage carefully, then offered her water again. This time she drank. And then, unexpectedly, violently, she began to cry. It wasn't the delicate kind of crying, not the cinematic sort. It was raw, messy, uncontrollable, a sound pulled from the core of grief. Every loss, every death, every ounce of fear she had buried came pouring out through trembling shoulders and gasping breaths. Hayes froze, unsure what to do. Miller looked away, pretending to check his rifle. In war, men learn to avoid tears, even their own. But in that tent, amid the smell of antiseptic and gun oil, the sound of one woman crying felt like a small miracle. For the first time since the island turned to ash, someone remembered how to feel. That night, when the lantern burned low and the rain eased to a whisper, Hana finally slept. Outside, Miller smoked his last cigarette. Hayes sat nearby, staring at the stars barely visible through the clouds. "You think she trusts us now?" Hayes asked. Miller exhaled a thin stream of smoke. "Trusts a long road, son. But she's walking on it." Hayes nodded, silent. In the distance, thunder rolled, or maybe artillery. It didn't matter. For one brief moment, the war felt smaller than it had ever been. Somewhere between enemies and strangers, they had found a sliver of something bigger than either side could name. Not peace. Not forgiveness. Just humanity. And that was enough to keep them breathing until morning. By the time the rain stopped, the war had already changed shape. The jungle was quieter now, though the smell of gunpowder still clung to everything, clothes, tents, even dreams. And in the middle of it all, beneath an American flag fluttering limply over a row of field cots, Hana woke to the sound of men laughing. Not the laughter of cruelty, the other kind. The kind she hadn't heard in years. She sat up slowly, wrapped in a clean blanket. Her arm was bandaged, her face washed. Someone had left a tin of peaches beside her, the label bright and foreign, like it came from another world. On the other side of the tent, Private Hayes noticed her stirring. He smiled, lifted a hand and said softly, "Morning, Miss Hana." That was what they called her now, Miss Hana. Not prisoner, not enemy, not number. Just a name, spoken with the easy politeness of young Americans raised to say ma'am to their mothers. The medics treated her like any other patient. A temperature chart hung by her bed. Every few hours, someone checked her pulse, changed her bandages, or offered water with a clumsy grin. They didn't know much Japanese and she barely understood their English, but decency doesn't need translation. She could feel it in the way they knocked gently on the tent pole before entering, or how they turned away when she changed into clean clothes. In another corner of the camp, Sergeant Miller wrote in his notebook, a letter to his wife back home in Kansas. He'd written hundreds before, but this one came slower. His handwriting, rough and uneven, told the story of a man trying to make sense of something beautiful in a place built for death. "Mary," he wrote, "we found a girl in a cave. Japanese. Maybe 24, maybe younger. She was half-starved, scared to death. But when Hayes gave her water, she looked at him like he'd just saved the whole damn world. She's not the enemy anymore. If you saw her eyes you'd know, war lied to us both." He paused, staring at the paper. The words felt dangerous, like confessing a sin, or admitting that hatred was easier than compassion. But he kept writing anyway. "She helps around the infirmary now. Doesn't say much, but she smiles when the boys give her chocolate. Reminds me of how you used to smile when I brought you flowers from the store. Funny how? Halfway across the world and it's the same look." Miller folded the letter carefully, sealed it, and tucked it into his rucksack. He didn't know if the mail would ever reach Kansas. But sometimes, a man writes just to remember who he is. Life in the Pacific base was never peaceful, only less violent. The sound of planes came and went. Rain turned dirt into rivers. At night, the jungle crackled with insects and faraway gunfire. But within the camp, there was rhythm. Orders barked at dawn, rations counted, bandages rolled, prayers whispered before sleep. And in that rhythm, Hana became part of the pattern. The first few days she moved like a shadow, silent, careful not to draw attention. Then one morning she began to help. No one told her to. She just saw a soldier struggling to carry a bucket of water and took the other handle. The medic laughed. "Thank you, Miss Hana." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Soon she was helping everywhere. Folding sheets, handing out towels, even teaching the younger Marines how to pronounce basic Japanese phrases. They butchered every syllable of course, but she laughed softly when they tried. That laugh, light, honest, alive, spread through the camp like sunlight through the smoke. The Americans taught her things too. They showed her how to use a can opener, how to tie shoelaces, how to say thank you and freedom. The last one took time. "Freedom," Hayes said, pointing to his chest. She frowned, repeating, "Freedom?" He nodded, smiling. Then he pointed toward the open sky. "Freedom," he said again, slower, as if the air itself might help her understand. She looked up, at the clouds, the birds, the endless blue. In her language, there was no perfect equivalent. But she felt it anyway. Freedom. It wasn't about borders or flags. It was the way the soldiers joked, how they played cards and sang around the fire, how they didn't bow when they spoke but still treated each other like equals. That, she realized, was its shape. At night, when the work slowed, the camp would fill with music. Someone had a gramophone, another had a battered guitar. They played jazz, the soft, swaying kind that smelled of home and whiskey and girls in bright dresses. Hana sat near the edge of the circle, eyes wide, hands folded in her lap. Hayes offered her a piece of chocolate once, and she hesitated before taking it. The sweetness almost startled her. For a moment she forgot the taste of rationed rice in fear. The Marines cheered when she smiled. Someone passed her a can of Coca-Cola, her first. She took a sip, made a face at the bubbles, and everyone laughed. Hayes laughed hardest. And for that brief second, no one was a soldier, no one was an enemy, just people trying to remember what peace might feel like. That night, under a canopy of smoke and stars, Miller wrote another letter. "Mary, you wouldn't believe this place. We're still surrounded by hell, but inside camp, It feels almost human. We share songs with a girl who once thought we were monsters. She's teaching the boys Japanese words. They sound ridiculous coming out of those southern mouths, but damn, it makes us laugh. He paused, staring at the flame of his lighter, watching it bend in the wind. Sometimes I wonder if we'd known each other before all this. If we'd sat at the same table eaten the same food, would any of this war have happened? Maybe that's what freedom really means, Mary. The chance to see the other side and still choose kindness. He closed the notebook, lit a cigarette, and watched the smoke rise. Across the camp, Hana hummed a melody she'd learned from the gramophone, off-key, gentle, hauntingly pure. Miller smiled to himself. If there was still music in the world, maybe humanity wasn't lost after all. Weeks passed. The war outside raged on, but inside the camp, time slowed, measured not by battles, but by the quiet gestures that built trust grain by grain. Hana no longer flinched when footsteps approached her tent. She laughed when the Marines teased each other over poker, and sometimes she even joined them, pretending to play though she never quite understood the rules. The men joked that she brought them luck, and maybe she did. When new supplies arrived, she helped the medics distribute them. She folded bandages, carried messages, even taught a few nurses how to write simple Japanese phrases like peace, thank you, and heart. Her handwriting, neat and delicate, fascinated the soldiers who had only ever written their names on dog tags. In the evenings, Hayes often found her sitting by the fire, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick. He would sit nearby, careful not to disturb her, and they would share a silence that said more than words ever could. One night, he pointed at her drawing. It was a small house with a garden. Home? He asked. She nodded. Then she looked at him and pointed in return. America? He smiled. Yeah, he said softly. Kansas. Big fields. Corn everywhere. Smells like rain and dirt. He laughed at himself, unsure if she understood any of it. But she smiled anyway, and somehow that was enough. She wanted to tell him about her own home, about Nagasaki's quiet mornings, the temple bells, the smell of fish markets and charcoal. But her English was thin and her heart heavier still. So she simply said, beautiful, and meant it. There was no need for confession. In their silence there was respect, a fragile peace born not of treaties or flags, but of two human beings daring to see each other clearly. One afternoon, a transport unit arrived to move the wounded to another base. Hana was told she would go too, under guard as a civilian detainee. The announcement hit her harder than she expected. The camp had become something she hadn't thought possible, a home. When she stepped into the jeep, Hayes was there, his uniform dusty, his face sunburned from too many days in the field. He handed her a small paper bag. Inside was a bar of chocolate and a folded photograph, the camp's men posing together, grinning wide, with "To Miss Hana" scrawled on the back. She pressed it to her chest. Then, before she could stop herself, she reached out and took his hand. It was rough, warm, human. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't answer. He just squeezed her fingers gently and nodded. For a moment, the noise of engines and shouting faded. It was just them, two people once enemies, now bound by something stronger than fear. As the jeep pulled away, dust rising behind her, Hana looked back at the camp. The men waved. She waved too, smiling through tears. And in that moment, something in her shifted forever. She no longer believed the stories she'd been told about Americans, or about war itself. Because in the middle of the fire, she had found mercy. Months later, when the war ended, Hana was transferred to a Red Cross facility in Okinawa. By then the bombs had fallen, one on her hometown. Nagasaki was gone. Her family, her students, her life, all vanished in an instant of blinding light. She sat by the ocean for hours trying to imagine what remained. Sometimes she thought of the camp. Of Miller's laughter, the smell of rain, the strange sweetness of Coca-Cola. And of Hayes, the quiet Marine who never looked at her like an enemy. One morning a letter arrived. It bore no return address, only a smudged name, Private Daniel Hayes. Miss Hana, it read, I hope this finds you safe. I don't know if you'll ever come to America, but if you do, look for the fields of Kansas. You'll smell the rain before you see them. War took a lot from both of us, but it also showed me something I'll never forget, that kindness can survive anything. Her tears blurred the ink. She folded the letter carefully like a prayer and held it to her heart. Years later, long after the headlines faded and the medals rusted, Stories spread among veterans of a Japanese woman who had once been a prisoner but later came to America. They said she married a Marine. That she opened a small shop in California. That she smiled whenever she heard jazz on the radio. No one knew if it was true. But those who had served in that distant camp swore they remembered her, the girl who taught them that even in hell there is room for grace. In the end, Hana's story wasn't about who won or lost. It was about the quiet victory of decency. About a choice, made not with weapons but with compassion. Because sometimes, mercy is the most powerful act of war. Sometimes, Miller once said in his last letter home, kindness speaks louder than victory. Morning came heavy with heat and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from exhaustion, the world holding its breath. In the camp, the men gathered around a battered radio set propped on an ammunition crate. Static hissed through the humid air. Then came a voice, distant, formal, trembling with history. It spoke Japanese, a language most of them didn't understand, but its tone said everything. Hana froze. The voice was unmistakable, calm, solemn, fragile like porcelain under pressure. It was the Emperor himself. August 15, 1945. The moment Japan surrendered. The moment an empire ended. Her hands shook as she clutched the edge of the cot. Every syllable felt like an earthquake inside her chest. The words she had been raised to believe would never be spoken, surrender, compassion, humanity, now fell like rain on parched ground. The American soldiers didn't celebrate, not at first. They just stood there, heads bowed, listening to the static fade into nothing. No cheers, no shouts, just disbelief. Because after years of fire and blood, they weren't sure what peace even sounded like. Then Miller, who had been staring at the dirt, finally spoke. So, it's over. No one answered. The jungle didn't care. The flies still buzzed, the wind still carried the smell of salt and smoke. But deep down, something enormous had shifted, the kind of change you can't see, only feel. Hana stepped out of the medical tent. The sun was blinding, cruelly bright. She blinked hard, her vision blurred by tears. For a moment, she thought she should fall to her knees, as her teachers once said one must when the emperor spoke. But instead, she simply stood there, her heart torn open. She didn't cry for defeat. She cried for release. For the boys she had taught in Nagasaki who would never come home. For the fiancé she had buried with her bare hands. For her country, wounded, deceived, but finally free from the chains of war. Hayes approached quietly. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside her, watching the horizon where smoke still lingered from last night's shelling. She turned to him, eyes red, voice barely a whisper. It's finished? He nodded. It's finished. The words hit her harder than any bomb. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to exhale, a long, trembling breath that carried the ghosts of everything she had lost. And then, without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. No fear this time. Just gratitude. Just life. Hayes didn't pull away. He squeezed her fingers gently, the same way he had that day by the jeep, when everything between them was uncertain and new. There were no words big enough for what they both felt. So they stood there, silent, two survivors bound not by war but by mercy. By sunset, the camp buzzed with new orders. American command had issued instructions. All prisoners of war and civilian detainees were to be repatriated as soon as possible. Lists were made. Transport ships scheduled. Medical clearances signed in ink that still smelled wet. Hana's name appeared on the third manifest. Destination, Nagasaki, or what was left of it. When Miller read the order aloud, the camp fell quiet. Even the men who didn't know her well shifted uncomfortably, like they were losing someone who had become part of their fragile balance. Hayes said nothing at first. He just looked at the paper, then at her, eyes dark, jaw tight. She smiled, trying to hide the ache inside. Home, she said softly. But the word no longer meant what it once did. Home was a memory now, a place built on ashes. That night, the soldiers gathered for one last meal together. Someone found a can of pineapple slices and divided it into tin cups. It was all they had to celebrate with. They raised them high. To the end of the war, Miller said. Then he looked at Hana. And to peace, wherever it decides to live. Laughter rippled softly through the tent. Even Hana smiled, though her heart felt like it was breaking open all over again. At dawn, a jeep waited near the airstrip. The sky was the color of faded paper, washed pale by light and memory. Hana climbed in, her suitcase, a soldier's duffel bag someone had given her, resting on her lap. Hayes stood beside the vehicle, helmet under his arm. He looked like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally, he leaned closer and said quietly, "If you ever come to America, look for me." His voice was steady but his eyes betrayed him, the kind of eyes that already missed her. She nodded, tears shining but unshed. "I will," she whispered. Then, as if afraid he hadn't understood, she repeated it in slow, careful English. "I will." The engine coughed to life. She reached out one last time, her fingers brushing his. The touch lingered just long enough to promise what words couldn't. As the Jeep rolled down the dirt road, Hayes raised his hand in salute, not the rigid kind taught in boot camp but one born of respect. A farewell between equals. Hana turned back once, her hair catching the wind, eyes bright with tears. The jungle swallowed her silhouette. And with her departure, the camp felt emptier than ever. That night, Hayes sat by the dying fire, the air thick with the smell of rain and burnt wood. He pulled out the photograph she had left behind, the one of the camp, the laughter, the faces. He traced her name with a calloused thumb. Somewhere out there, the world was beginning again. Cities rebuilding. Ships returning. People daring to dream of peace. But for Hayes, the war had ended in that single whisper beside the Jeep. "If you ever come to America, look for me." And for the rest of his life, he would carry that promise like a medal no one could see. It was 20 years later when Hana stepped off the train. The air in California smelled different, dry, sweet, and tinged with the faint salt of the Pacific. The war felt like another lifetime, yet her hands still trembled the way they had that morning on the island, when a Marine had given her water instead of bullets. The station was quiet except for the hiss of brakes and the murmur of travelers. Then she saw him. Standing by the wooden bench, older now, lines etched deep around his eyes, hair lighter but unmistakably him. For a second neither moved. Then, slowly, they began to walk toward each other, as if afraid the dream might shatter if they hurried. No grand music, no applause. Just two survivors finding the piece of peace they'd lost decades ago. When they finally met, he took her suitcase wordlessly. She smiled, the same quiet smile she'd given him the day she left. And he said softly, "Took you long enough." They married that winter. No church bells, no white dress. Just a small ceremony in a garden behind a modest house on the outskirts of San Diego. Miller sent a letter of congratulations, said he still kept the pineapple tin lid from that last meal, for luck. Hana and Hayes built a life that was ordinary in the most extraordinary way. He worked at the docks, she tended a small vegetable garden. They never had children, some losses can't be rewritten, but the neighborhood kids adored her. She always had sweets ready, and her laughter, soft and steady, became part of the street's soundscape. Every morning, she watered the azaleas and listened to the distant whistle of trains. Sometimes, she'd hum the Japanese lullaby she used to sing to her students in Nagasaki. Other times, Hayes would sit on the porch, tapping his fingers to old jazz tunes on a radio that crackled like memory itself. Their neighbors didn't ask too many questions. They just saw kindness, the kind that makes no noise but changes everything it touches. In her later years, Hana wrote a small journal. Nothing grand, just fragments of thoughts pressed between recipes and letters. On one yellowed page she wrote, "The enemy taught me compassion. The war taught me the value of peace. And love taught me that forgiveness is the only victory that lasts." When she died, Hayes found that notebook under her pillow. He read it through tears, tracing her careful handwriting with his rough, scarred fingers. He placed the journal by the garden she had planted, beside the azaleas that now bloomed wild and bright, as if the earth itself remembered her. And every spring after, when the flowers opened again, the neighbors would say the same thing. She made this place softer. War had taken their countries, their homes, their futures, but in the end, it had given them something far rarer. It had given them each other. Because sometimes, love doesn't bloom after war. It blooms from it. In the cracks, in the ruins, in the small acts of mercy that refuse to die. And in those moments, the quiet ones, the human ones, the world remembers what it's fighting for. War begins with fear dressed as loyalty, hatred masquerading as honor. And yet, somewhere amid the noise and smoke, two people on opposite sides of a rifle remembered how to be human. Hana, the woman taught to die rather than surrender, learned that compassion could bloom even in captivity. Hayes, the soldier trained to fight without mercy, learned that victory meant more than survival. Their story wasn't about who won or lost, it was about what remained after the winning stopped. In their smallest moments, a shared meal, a bandaged wound, a quiet promise, the world's most brutal war softened into something recognizably human. And that is the paradox of it all. The closer people come to destruction, the more clearly they can see what's worth saving. The Marines who treated their prisoners with decency didn't just obey the Geneva Convention. They obeyed something deeper, the conscience of a nation that believes morality is not weakness but strength. Because the truest test of civilization isn't how fiercely one fights, but how gently one rebuilds. That is the American way, not perfection but compassion. Not dominance but decency. Not conquest but conscience. History often remembers wars by their weapons and generals. But perhaps it should remember them by the hands that chose to heal instead of harm. The hearts that looked past flags and saw faces. Because in the end, humanity is the only legacy worth defending. Under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest. And maybe that's the quiet truth that outlived the noise of war, that mercy, not might, defines who we are. It was found in a dusty archive box, buried deep in a museum basement in Washington, D.C. A faded black and white photograph, edges curled with time. A young American Marine stood beside a Japanese woman, both smiling beneath an American flag fluttering in the background. No medals, no ceremony, just two faces lit by sunlight and peace. The curator didn't know their names. The note on the back simply read, Okinawa 1945, after the surrender. No one could have guessed that the woman once hid in a cave terrified of poison. Or that the man once marched through jungles believing mercy was weakness. All that was left was the image, proof that the heart remembers what nations forget. The narrator, perhaps you, perhaps me, stands before the glass staring at that frozen moment. And it hits like quiet thunder. This isn't a story about love or war or politics. It's about decency. The kind that doesn't need language or victory or even understanding. Just the courage to see another person and still choose kindness. The camera captured it in a single click. The world almost forgot it happened. But the photograph remained, silent, steadfast, eternal. In the end, mercy won the war that guns never could. And maybe that's the truest record of history we'll ever need.